From Relay FM, this is Upgrade episode 512, recorded Monday, May the 13th, 2024. I am Jason Snell. Mike Hurley is off this week. He's traveling and having fun, while we are down to the difficult, hard-working business of doing things like reviewing a brand new iPad Pro. That's coming later in the show. But first, let me tell you, we're sponsored this week. Fitbod, Delete Me, ExpressVPN, and participating in the show this week, there is no one else who should be here for episode 512, like the proprietor of 512pixels.com, the fork bomber himself, the Mac Daddy himself. It's Stephen Hackett. Hi, Stephen.
I wasn't expecting a fork bomber joke
I don't
today.
know. I was thinking about your website. That's all.
Yeah, that was the old name. It's a programming joke. It's not nothing else. Just a programming joke.
No, 512 pixels though, from the original Mac had 512.
That's
pixels.
right. Yeah, a little DPI humor.
Yeah, little screen resolution reference from 2 years before you were born.
That's true. Hello, Jason.
Hi,
Thank you for having
Stephen.
me. It's always fun to talk about computers with you. We don't get to
Yes.
do it very often.
It's true. It's true. And also it took, I'm going to keep saying this in this episode, it took two co-hosts of Connected to replace Mike.
I don't like that.
I don't love it either. I guess he's the Archbishop of Rickyton or something. I don't know how that works. He's won a lot of things over there. And of course, he's also the Upgrade Draft champion. He won't let me forget about that. So Federico will be joining me later to talk about the iPad Pro, because the iPad Pro announced last week, and I got one on Wednesday and have been using it ever since, pretty much as my only computer. And so I wrote my review on it. I traveled over the weekend, which is actually kind of fitting for an iPad Pro to travel and roam around and also be working on it and reviewing it. And who better, I think, to talk about iPad Pro stuff than Federico, who did not review the iPad Pro, but he did write a big article on Mac Stories, and we're going to talk about that a little bit more too, about his sort of. We got a lot of feedback here, and I know that Federico got it too. We got a lot of feedback here from people who last week they found our clips on YouTube, so I guess that is working. About complaining about the iPad, but they have no context of all of our past complaints. And so several people swooped in and said, could you list some complaints? And Federico was glad to oblige and wrote an entire article about his complaints about iPadOS and its limitations. So that'll be good.
It's a great article. I know you're going to be talking to him later in the show. I did realize, though, just now, that you having both Federico and I on the show on the same day, the same episode, you actually were forbidden to choose between us because you can't flip a coin, and so you were stuck with both of us.
Actually, coin flipping is allowed on Upgrade. It's just discouraged.
Be publicly shamed.
All of those things. I heard about all those things. But hey, Stephen, before we get started, I think it's time to do a Snell Talk question. Can you handle this one for me?
This could turn into a smell talk question. So
it is.
This comes from Upgradian Sam. What is your favorite airline snack, Jason? And why isn't it 4-hour-old room temperature sushi? I was sitting right behind you, and I didn't know if you got to experience the glory that was my roommate tucking into some sushi at least 4 hours into our flight. But boy, that was rough.
So Sam told the story at the Newark airport the day after the Apple event. Sam, I'm sitting there doing I don't even know what, and somebody waves at me, and I look up, and it's Sam, who I've never met before, and he turns around his iPhone to show the Ask Upgrade chapter art.
Incredible.
Which I immediately tell you and Mike about.
Yeah, it was great.
So what I didn't know is that Sam sat a row behind me and didn't say anything, which is like, you could have said something. I guess it was a little, he's not stalking me because it's like literally we were just assigned those seats. Anyway, after I got off, I did chat with Sam, and he said some nice things, and I thanked him for listening to the podcast. It was really nice. But I didn't know until later that he had sent in a Snell Talk question about the 4-hour-old room temperature sushi. I don't think smell the sushi, but there was a smell. I kind of thought it was coming from the bathroom because we were only a couple rows ahead of the bathroom. But my favorite, not talk about unpleasant things anymore. My favorite airline snack. I don't have a single go-to like James Thompson, our friend, who I discovered having had many flights with him now. He has a very particular type of cheddar cracker that he gets as and I think he gets it even at the airport. And it's readily available, not a brand available in America, but in the UK, and that's what he has, and that's his comfort food, probably since he was a kid. I like, let's see, I like chocolate on a trip. I try to bring some dark chocolate with me in my bag on a trip, so I've got some chocolate.
And then it melts right into your iPad.
So I was going to say, the highlight or the low light of my chocolate travels is that we went, you and I, to Johnson Space Center and spent a whole day on the big long tour, while out in the car, my backpack containing a bar of chocolate sat in the blazing hot Houston sun.
Houston, Texas.
And I got to the airport and a molten wave of chocolate had covered the case for my Sony headphones. They got the worst of it. And Julian used those headphones for a while, and every now and then I would see the case and I would just think, that's Houston chocolate there, baby.
Houston chocolate.
Oh, so you got to mind where your chocolate. Ever since then, you got to mind where your chocolate is. Don't leave it in the hot. But so that's one. I love those ginger. I love ginger like cookies and stuff in general. So those Biscoffs that are on the Biscoff cookies that are on like Delta and American now does it too, which I feel like they're kind of ripping off Delta, because I think that's a Delta thing, right? Yeah, I got American. My last American flight. They offered me Biscoffs. I was like, okay, does Delta know you're doing this? Yeah. But they're really nice. They're little snappy ginger cookies. They're great. I love them. So that's a favorite. Yeah.
They're also an iPhone app developer. Our friend Matt Bischoff. That's a different thing.
Oh, I thought you meant the Delta emulator, which does not emulate an airline.
Also a different thing.
Do you have a favorite airline snack?
I was thinking about this. I think you got to be careful with airline snacks, because you don't want something that's going to be like crunchy and make a mess, right? So that rolls out like some granola bars and that sort of thing.
Sure.
And you want something that obviously doesn't melt, right? Like your Houston experience, no good.
No.
So I think I'm going to go with like an RX bar kind of thing, right? Like it's prepackaged. It will get soft, but it's not going to melt, but also critically not crumbly. That's what bothers me with an airplane snack. If I feel like I'm sitting in crumbs on my way to California, I don't want that.
I get that. That is the danger with the Biscoff, is that, you take a bite and then you've got ginger crumbs all down your shirt and all that. But
better than sushi crumbs.
What I was going to say, what I really like to do is get some sushi a few days before and just tuck it into the bag.
Oh.
And then, eventually I'll go through security and I'll get on the plane, and in the middle of a 5-hour flight, I'll take it out.
Just bust it out. Yeah, that's no good.
Thank you, Sam.
No good at all.
Thank you, Sam, for the Snell Talk question. I appreciate it. Well, that brings us to some follow-up. I thought, okay, that is just say it out loud. Say it out loud. Follow up. I wanted to talk about I didn't want to talk about it. How about that? Here's follow-up that I don't want to talk about, but I feel like we are obligated to talk about it. So when I was in New York, I watched that video like everybody else, and we were in a group, and kind of no reaction to the Crush ad that everybody was talking about afterward. And in going back, I remember having some negative feelings about it. They were mostly about my feelings about the actual objects being used in the commercial being destroyed, especially the piano. I was like, oh man, I hope that piano was really busted because they crushed it in a press, and I don't love it. But I didn't really think anything more of it. And then it became part of the discourse, and everybody started talking about how it was representative of how big tech was destroying creativity, which is really funny because I'm sure Apple didn't intend it that way at all, and Apple really does legitimately think that it's a partner of and an enabler of creative people, and that project, that commercial was literally trying to get that across, and they ended up having it really backfire on them. But I think it seems to me that it shows like Apple not understanding how it's viewed. And I don't want to draw too much of a parallel to some of Apple's business decisions in terms of playing hardball with developers and dealing with regulators and all of that. But I do think there's a line running through both of these stories, which is Apple still really fancying itself the underdog and the champion of the masses, when in fact it is actually a top dog and a big shot. And that, I think that's maybe one explanation for how you create an ad that misreads the vibe in the room. Because I think that's, for me, that's the big offense here, is that I think they didn't get nobody apparently with any say so raised their hand and said, people are really concerned about big tech initiatives crushing creative jobs right now.
Yeah.
And so I think they really misread the room. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so too. I agree with you on first watching, like just during the stream. It jumped out at me a little bit, but then obviously the headlines started coming out. And this like made the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. This wasn't just like us, kind of playing on our level. It was, mainstream news, for better or for worse. And my first thought was, well, that feels like maybe some misdirected anger. I thought about like, well, something like GarageBand has had virtual instruments forever. This is just sort of a riff on that idea. Mm-hmm. But the more I've thought about it, especially over the weekend, the more I've realized that I think what you said is right, that they did, whoever made the ultimate decision, we don't know the debates that happened. I would like to think some people at Apple saw this coming and maybe were overruled, which is unfortunate. But yeah, clearly they don't understand the vibe. And what makes that potentially way more troublesome is that we are now, as of today, 4 weeks away from WWDC, where Apple's expected to introduce a bunch of generative AI features across their OSs. And you said it really well. I just want to highlight it. Apple's best work in a lot of ways is empowering creative people to do their jobs. And those people are worried about this. And they view Apple as, the company that kind of gets them, or maybe at least used to get them. And this is going to drive a pretty big wedge in that. I think in a lot of ways, the world's reaction to this ad could be a warning shot for Apple of what to expect at WWDC. Now, Google goes first, right? Google I/O is before WWDC. I think I/O is this week. We may see a little bit of that. But I think with Apple, it is going to be different and potentially worse, because Apple positions itself as the company that makes cool stuff for creative people. And I just don't know how you circle that square. And if I were Apple, I would be looking at these reactions and really carefully considering how they frame these features that are going to be coming in just a month.
So I have a theory, which is that I think maybe this is a blessing in disguise for Apple. I mean, they came out and apologized. They had their VP of marketing, Tor Mirin, basically said, we're sorry that we want to celebrate creatives. We missed the mark. Having it be not an unnamed person, like that's good. It was textbook damage control, right? Like what you want to do is move on. And so I heard some people were like, I can't believe they apologized for that. And it's like, you know what? This is how you do it. It's like, look, it obviously it doesn't matter. What you don't want to do is get in an argument. It's like, no, you don't understand. That's not what we meant. You got it wrong. Think again. Like, no, you just say, I'm sorry. It obviously didn't work, right? It obviously rubbed a bunch of people the wrong way. And once you call attention to it, then everybody else is going to see it in that lens, and then it's over. But I think maybe it is a warning to them that they can now take heed of. And that maybe having it happen in this sort of footnote to a footnote, an iPad event, but a month before WWDC might be a wake-up call to say, oh, those of us, or again, because Apple is not a monolith, Apple, there are people inside Apple who totally get what's going on here, and they were not listened to. So this gives them voice to say, we really need to be careful about this because everybody is wary of big tech ruining jobs with AI and destroying creative processes with AI. I also feel like Apple's whole thing, and we've talked about it on so many podcasts over the years, Apple's whole thing is that they have been using what they called machine learning, which is what we would now call AI, all along. But they productize it. They put it in features. They say, oh, here's a feature to make your photos look better. And what they're not doing is saying, here's a thing that means you don't need to have an expert take pictures for you or edit your photos later. It's more like, well, no, you're shooting your own photos and you press a button. Even something like the features that they announced in Logic last week, because they had Drummer, which is an AI drummer for a while now, and they added a bassist and a keyboard player. I'm surprised that didn't come in for more scrutiny and spite from people saying, oh, you're taking jobs and all that. But then again, the way the feature is pitched is it's not so you don't ever need to hire a drummer. It's that you're somebody who is alone in your room making music and you want it to sound better because you're making a demo. And if you become famous, then probably you won't use the Logic drummer anymore.
Yeah, you'll hire a drummer.
You'll hire a drummer. and I think that's an important distinction, right? It's like it's not meant to take jobs away from creative people. It's actually meant to enable creative people to make their work better. And I know that's a fine line. So I feel like Apple, of all companies, is probably not banking on AI as a replacement for creativity. They're probably already pitching everything as ways to make creative people work better, more productive, but not like remove that spark. And that's good. And now they've gotten this warning shot because they do need to tread carefully here. But I think with this warning, I would be shocked if they weren't going through everything that they were planning, all the scripts, whatever they've even already shot for WWDC, and saying, how do we let's just go over all of it and see what are we stepping in here, and are there things we can change? And so on that front, they're lucky that they've got a month to maybe back off or at least analyze some of what they're going to announce, and not through the lens of the people are uneasy about big tech and AI right now, and you are big tech and AI, even if you don't, you're like, oh, no, we're different. It's like they don't think you're different. So keep that in mind the whole time.
No, I think that's well said. I think the last thing I would tack onto that is I suspect if they had any really visual elements of that, they will be toned down during the keynote. I think one reason this ad hit the way that it did is that you're seeing all these beloved objects be destroyed. And, several people did it. It's floating around social media. Running the ad in reverse is like actually kind of a better ad in a lot of ways. But I think a large part of the reaction to this is we see it, right? We see these in many cases beautiful things be destroyed, whether they were real or CGI or a combination, who knows? But I suspect if there was anything remotely like that in the keynote, that is getting cut out as we speak, and that they're going to, I think you said it really, they're going to pitch this kind of the way they pitched. I mean, I went back and actually skimmed the original like GarageBand announcement. It's like, yeah, this lets you do things you couldn't do before. That's the best way to pitch a feature from Apple's perspective. And they missed that in this ad. And yeah, I think in the long run, I'm sure it's painful right now for them to be dealing with this. But I think you're right. Long term, this may have been a good thing that it was just the iPad and not the new version of the software that's going to be on a bajillion iPhones in the fall. Yeah,
well, we're not arguing, I think, for the fact that this was a huge huge mistake that offended us. Like the ad didn't bother me that much. The point is, it misfired. Like, and it doesn't matter. You could be like, well, actually, it's fine. Like, it doesn't matter. It's an ad. It's marketing. It's meant to engender a certain kind of feeling. It engendered the opposite feeling. So as a result, it failed, even if it worked for you or it didn't bother you. And I think performed a service to Apple of saying you need to be a lot less complacent about your relationship, your place in the tech pantheon, and your relationship with creative people, because everybody's a little uneasy. And I think Apple could learn that lesson more broadly. I think that Apple still behaves very much like an underdog and doesn't understand how it's received, which is as a massive, rich, powerful gatekeeper that has complete control over so many aspects of people's lives. I think they just don't want to think of themselves that way, but they are that. And I think it leads to them doing things that you shouldn't do when you're the top dog. You should only really do when you're the underdog. And it's led them down a difficult path. But certainly in terms of the AI issue and its relationship with creative professionals, it's a little bit, I would think, of a shock to the system. And I hope that they follow from that, because I do believe that Apple fundamentally does think of itself as an enabler of creative people, and that's why this ad, just was a misfire, because they didn't read the room, right? Like, ultimately, I think that if this had been released 2 years ago or 4 years ago, it wouldn't have had this kind of uproar. But we live in a time where everybody's kind of on a knife's edge about this stuff, and Apple needs to be super careful about how it calibrates this. All right, Stephen, I'm going to bring in Federico, and you're gonna go away for a little bit.
Okay.
But just hang on. And before we go, also, I need to tell you about our first sponsor. It's Fitbod. And I don't use this, but you've used this, right?
I do use Fitbod. Fitbod is awesome. It's this iPhone app that learns all about you. You tell it what your fitness goals are. You tell it what equipment you have, and then it builds workouts for you. One of my favorite things in it is there's more than 1,000 demonstration videos, right? Like, I work out at home, and I want to make sure if I'm doing something new that I'm doing it correctly, right? That I'm doing it safely, that I'm doing it in the way that will be the most effective. And they have these HD videos with all of these workouts, so you can see it from multiple angles. So you can see what you're supposed to do. And it really puts me at ease, doing this basically home alone in my garage.
Yeah, so Fitbod is an easy and affordable way to build this fitness plan that's right for you, and everyone's fitness path is different, which is why Fitbod uses data to make sure they customize things to suit you and adapt as you improve. Muscles improve when working in concert with the entire muscular system, so you don't want to overwork some and underwork others. Fitbod tracks muscle fatigue and recovery to design that well-balanced workout routine on an easy-to-use app with progress tracking charts, weekly reports, sharing cards, and all sorts more, including integration with Apple Watch, Strava, Fitbit, Apple Health. Personalized training of this quality can be expensive, but Fitbod is just $12.99 a month or $79.99 a year, and you can get 25% off your membership by signing up at fitbod.me/upgrade. So go now and get your customized fitness plan at fitbod.me/upgrade. Once again, that's fitbod.me/upgrade for 25% off your membership. Thank you to Fitbod for supporting Upgrade and Relay FM. I'm now joined in this segment by yet another connected host who is not Mike. It is Federico Viticci from Mac Stories. Hi, Federico.
Hello, Jason. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's been a busy weekend.
Yes.
There's been a lot going on. Thank you for being here and not just being a ghost.
Of course. This time in the flesh.
Yes.
People can see me.
It's Federico present, not a ghostly apparition from the future. So, this is the iPad Pro review episode. I reviewed the iPad Pro, and we're releasing this at embargo time. This whole episode, which is exciting. I first need to say, I'm very happy to talk about iPad things with you.
Oh, likewise.
I felt like I thought we would both be working away on our own things about the iPad Pro, but a series of events occurred, and you didn't get an iPad Pro to review, so
no,
which I'm really sorry about. So you
fine.
You did rate a different article, so we're going to talk about that in a little bit. But I wanted to start with the iPad Pro because I can talk about it now. I spent the last 4 or 5 days working on an iPad Pro 100% of the time, which I don't.
Okay.
I usually do that when I travel. Or I have done that when I travel, haven't in a little while, but I just, even at home, other than a couple of podcasts where where I just didn't want to bother my co-hosts. I've basically been using the iPad Pro as my only device for the last 4 or 5 days.
Okay, so obviously I read your review, and I made some notes for questions that I wanna ask you.
Okay.
Before we get started, so which model did you get? Which version?
I have, and it matters more than maybe you would think. So it's the 13-inch. I got to keep saying 13-inch.
Not 12.9 anymore.
Not 12.9 in space black, which is a little bit darker, just like the other
It is
space
darker.
blacks.
Yeah.
Even the accessories that we think of, the dark gray of the outside of the keyboard, it is darker. I mean, I'm not quite sure I'd call it black, but it's darker.
It's
than
another
it was.
version of gray.
It is, yeah. It's a darker gray. It's
the many shades of gray.
Approaching black, but never quite reaching it. Yes. How many shades? Apple is getting up there in their number of shades of gray that it's got. It's not the 50 yet, but
if only that title was not taken.
Oh man. Yeah, 50 Shades of Space Gray. Oh boy, but anyway,
I will read that.
Yeah, sure. That's an amazing. It's actually not that interesting. It's just a story about Apple's Pro hardware. And it's a 1 terabyte model, which, because Apple is not going to send me one with a disabled CPU and less RAM. They want the full experience. So it's the 1 and 2 terabyte models, for those who do not know, are the ones that have the 4th performance core on the M4 processor and have 16 gigs of RAM instead of 8. So it's a pretty sizable spec difference when you go from the bottom 2 tiers to the top 2. It's no longer really a storage tier. It's a storage and CPU and RAM tier. So we should probably stop thinking of it as a storage tier.
Right. So how does it feel? Like that's the first question that I want to ask you. Coming from the 12.9, the reduction in terms of thickness and weight, like because I've only spent like 20 minutes with it when I was in London.
Right.
But using it for 5 days, how does it feel coming from the previous version?
It is, yeah, because I have been using the larger iPad Pro since there was only the larger iPad Pro, that first model, and I bought it, and I have been using those 2015, and that's been my iPad ever since.
You never downgraded to the 11-inch?
I never did. I occasionally pick up Lauren's 11-inch because she's got the 11-inch, and I pick it up and go, oh, wow, this is really nice and light, and then I look at the screen and go, it's kind of a small screen, and then I go back to the 13. So I've always had the bigger iPad. I think the big problem, this is my theory, I think the big problem with the larger iPad is that it's not just the weight, it's the fact that the weight is spread across so much more surface area that by the time you get to the far end, you're actually getting kind of a lever effect where the weight is so far out that it's pulling your hand down. It makes it feel, and plus it's a little bit ungainly. It's like just hard to, it's just, there's more of it, and it's more to move around, and it's a little bit more clumsy in those ways. And obviously this hasn't changed those dimensions at all, but I will say it is lighter. I think lighter is the thing that matters. I think it's really funny that Apple talks about the thinness. I actually asked them in one of my briefings, I said, are you really solving for thinness? Because it seems like lightness is the more important thing when it comes to this product. And their response was very typical Apple. It was, we are solving for thinness and lightness. I'm like, okay, right, yeah, you can do everything. Okay, fine. But so the thinness, I mean, it's noticeable. And although I would say I usually use this thing in a case, it's either in the Magic Keyboard or it's in the Smart Folio.
Which you also got.
Which I got in black.
Okay.
That one's actually just black. Because they didn't want to give me denim, a very exciting, not exciting blue. My current one I got the orange Smart Folio. I'm going to really miss that if I have to give that one up because the orange is
that was
so
a
nice.
good color. I had
really
one.
Good color.
It was a good color. Yeah.
So I like the thinness fine, but it isn't as apparent. Even, it is thinner than the old one in the Folio, but it makes it feel less thin to do that. I have to admit, I did take off the Folio sometimes and just use it completely with uncovered, completely naked. It was naked. And 50 Shades of Space Gray again. There's a lot of nudity going on here. It is amazing, right? It's amazing that it's that thin, but even then I would argue that the thinness doesn't really matter. Like, I'm never pinching my fingers together and going, oh, I wish my fingers were closer together with the iPad in between. I just I never, So it's the weight, and the weight is, I mean, on that large one, it's more than a quarter of a pound. It's an enormous difference in weight for something that was already fairly light. And that to me is where it makes the difference, is every time I pick it up, it's just a little bit lighter. It's a little bit less difficult to move around.
Okay.
And it means that when you put it in the Magic Keyboard, you get something that's basically the weight of a MacBook Air, which is, I think, what they should have been shooting for all along.
Okay. Okay. So, would you say that compared to the previous one, it's more usable, like as a one-handed tablet, compared to the previous gen, or still like because it's so large, like it's still kind of, you know, kind of awkward to
I mean,
hold.
more usable and less awkward, but like it's a
Mm.
continuum, right? I don't think that I would say, oh, it solved the awkwardness problem. It's still a very large screen, but the screen is so beautiful. I mean, really, that's the trade-off, and it's been the trade-off all along, is that that smaller model feels so good to hold, but it's a much smaller screen than the big model, and I really do enjoy having the screen. I think we'll talk about the Magic Keyboard in a little bit, I think, but
Yeah.
one of the things that I was reminded of when I was in New York is that I don't like typing on the 11-inch Magic Keyboard. I just think
It's a little too cramped.
yeah, I think it's too cramped. So one of the things that would drive me toward the 13 is that I do use the Magic Keyboard, and I love the 13-inch Magic Keyboard size, and it feels very much like a MacBook Air. And the 11 just is a little too compact for me. It just my fingers don't feel comfortable on it. But I would say, yeah, I mean, anytime you make it lighter and thinner, it's going to be less awkward. And so I would say, it's better. It's better. But it doesn't. I can't say it just solves the problem where you don't have to worry
Mm.
about it and you can just use a 13-inch iPad Pro and it's fine. It's still, I mean, it's still big, but the lighter it gets, it's why I keep coming back to lighter. I don't actually care that it's thin. I do care a lot that it's light, because that really makes a difference.
Right, right. And it's not like suddenly became an iPad mini that it's so comfortable to hold that it feels like a small tablet because you're still holding a 13-inch display after
Right.
all. So,
It is. I mean, holding it without any case on it at all, it really is amazing, because you do start to get that feeling that you can almost see Apple's vision for it as just a sheet of glass, an intelligent
mm,
sheet of glass. It is starting to really reach that point where when you're holding it and it's thin and it's light and it's this huge screen, that you start to think, I'm just holding a screen. Like, there's
mhm.
nothing. Where's the computer here? It's really kind of amazing. But, in real life, it's in a case, and it's and it's better. It's less awkward, but still a little bit, because it's so huge.
Right. Speaking of the display, so obviously the big change here is OLED, specifically tandem OLED. So in reading your review, you pointed out, I mean, obviously the colors, the brightness, the true blacks, but you also mentioned that OLED is even noticeable in the iPadOS UI itself. So, like, can you elaborate on this? Like, where did you notice, like, just simply working on your iPad, that the screen was better?
Yeah, I had the moments. For me, it was, since I'm a writer, it
Hmm.
was in text editing, where I had a
Okay.
text editor which was just black text on a white background, and it feels sharper. And I know that the OLED itself should not be sharper than the old one,
Hmm.
but I think what's happening is that black text is black.
Right.
And
You're
before,
actually, yeah, you're getting the better contrast
right.
between the, yeah.
Right, because the mini LED backlighting on the 12.9 inch, sorry, but that 12 inch isn't even a thing.
Yeah.
12.9 inch, last generation iPad Pro, last two generations, that backlighting scheme was good. It was better than what was on the 11 inch, and it had blooming because it had whatever 2,500 local dimming
Yeah.
zones. But on OLED, every pixel is its own dimming zone, so it's a pretty dramatic difference. And so overall, like, the OLED screen impressed me, but I was coming from a closer place to it than somebody who's using any other iPad Pro, where you didn't get the mid-range step to a
Hmm.
mini LED backlight that really did help a lot, even though it wasn't perfect. But I could still tell, yeah, I just had those moments where I was writing and I was looking at the black text on the screen and thinking, it's different. What is it about that? And that's what it is. It's got to be what it is that the black text is truly black, the white background was, truly white, and that if you do a reversal and you're using something like Ivory in OLED mode, the black background is completely black. Although in OLED mode, in Ivory, the way the theme works, the text is gray, which kind of bothers me. I kind of like the complete. I know some people don't like the look, but I kind of enjoy the complete contrast of black on white, where a lot of people, I guess, prefer sort of gray on black or black on gray. I like it. So anyway, that and then I've got background pictures that have blacks in them, and they're just black now. The contrast ratio difference is so dramatic, and like I said, the dimming zones mean that it was pretty good before on my iPad Pro on the M1 and M2 generation, but it's just it surprised me. It came at me in surprising moments where I would look at something and think, what am I seeing there? Oh, right. It's got to be that this is another function of OLED. And, a sci-fi movie or TV show playing on the screen. I watched a few of those. I watched Star Trek. I watched Doctor Who. And, whenever you've got a space scene, like the space is very black and the stars are light, like little white pinpoints, or the lights on the spaceship are little white pinpoints, and you don't have that kind of hazy glow around them like you do on the mini LED version. Very
nice. Did you get the glossy version or the nano texture?
It's the untextured, the just pure glass glossy version. I saw the nano texture in New York, and you saw it in London. And what I thought was interesting is that I got the distinct impression from people I talked to at Apple that they're positioning it as not for everybody. They're like, if you don't know you need it, you don't need it, because I think they know that it undercuts what the OLED looks like. You're putting a haze in front of that OLED, but what you get is the ability to use in bright sunlight. So I think their vision is for it to be for like cinematographers and editors and photographers who are out in the field in bright sunlight and just can't work without it. But mine was just regular, and I used it in my house and in my backyard and on a trip. Actually, one of the things that was nice was I was traveling this weekend, which was really lousy in the sense that I had a Monday embargo, and we were visiting our kids up in Oregon, and I didn't love the fact that I had a very limited amount of time to write this review, and I had to travel at the same time. So I warned my family. I was like, I'm going to have to do some iPad things, and they went off and did something on Saturday afternoon, and I worked at an outdoor beer garden, actually.
Nice.
And it was warm. I was sitting outside and using the Magic Keyboard and writing. And then later I also did a podcast, and I recorded that in the hotel basically. And then I posted it in the back of the car as we were driving down the freeway to see my son, who lives down in Eugene at the university. My daughter lives in Portland. And in both of those instances, I actually thought about you, and you writing about how you were driven to the iPad specifically because you needed the portability of it. And so this trip to Oregon this weekend actually proved to be a good time. I wouldn't have chosen it for personal reasons, but it was actually a really great time to focus on using the iPad, because the thing that the iPad does so well is that mobility, that I was able to travel. I didn't travel with a laptop. I just brought the iPad. I was able to write thousands of words. I was able to work outside at that place, and in the back of the car, upload a podcast to the internet using 5G. And it all just was pleasant. It was really nice. And it's a very, like, even more than a laptop, it is just a very, very capable device. iPads in general, right? Not this one in particular, but iPads in general, this is one of the great things about them, is that it can do all of these different things. We can watch a movie on it and I can hold it in one hand, but I can also snap it into that case. And it's a 5G laptop that I can use at outside at a beer garden or in the back of a car to post something to the internet.
Yeah. What about battery life? So we had the new bright display. It's thinner. The battery is technically smaller than before, but is it the same as before, basically?
Yeah, I wonder, I think it's fine. It seems to be the same. They seem to have continued to solve for 10 hours as their goal.
Mm-hmm.
I used it most of the day on Saturday on a single charge, and I got back and I was still at like 40%. So it wasn't even close. But I wonder, like, what do you think about this? They clearly traded off the energy savings in the M4 to slice battery out of it to make it thinner and lighter rather than being able to claim 15 hours. Do you think they're solving for the right amount of battery power, or do you think that they need to, maybe embrace a little bit more weight in order to get the battery life up a little?
It's tricky because ideally I would say, yeah, I want to have more battery life. I don't care because I'm mostly going to use this in a Magic Keyboard. And so it doesn't necessarily matter. But then for those times when you do want to use it as a tablet, imagine if it was thicker and heavier. Like, I do think that, like you mentioned, like solving for lightness more than thickness is more important in the long run. And especially if you have these large tablets and maybe down the road, even a larger tablet, if they ever do one, I do think that they need to prioritize making sure that it's comfortable to use when you're not attaching it to a keyboard. So it's difficult, right? Because on the one hand, 10 hours, I mean, you can get laptops that last 15 or more. And so it's not as impressive maybe as it used to be 10 years ago, but actually 14 years ago, I guess at this point. But at the same time, an iPad not getting lighter and not getting thinner, like especially a 13-inch one, I don't know. I don't think their decision is like, of all their decisions with the iPad, the way I see it, maybe this is the least controversial one.
Yeah, I while I was writing the article, and you do this too with your reviews, I'm sure, you sometimes you end up talking about it on a podcast, but sometimes you end up sort of having a little argument with yourself as you're writing or as you're taking notes. And I went back and forth with myself over the weekend thinking about the battery life and thinking about the weight. And I think philosophically the product should be, I mean, John Syracuse always talks about the naked robotic core, but I think there's something in there about thinking about what the base product is and realizing that a user has to carry around the base product 100% of the time, whether they use the functionality you've built into it or not, which is a strong argument that you should only build in functionality that really matters to the widest selection of people, as long as there's an alternative. So you can't plug in more RAM, right? Like there are lots of things you can't plug in or you wouldn't want to. But with battery life, I do feel like 10 hours is enough. And if it's not enough, you should be able to plug in, or you should have some sort of a power bank that you can use. But to weigh down every single iPad user with additional battery that most of them probably won't use, because most of them are probably not going to drain it to zero in a scenario where they couldn't just plug it in, I think would be a mistake, right? Like I think in the end, if you're Apple, you're trying to please the most people, and they probably have the stats. They probably know that it almost never happens that somebody drains this thing, goes from full to draining it completely. I mean, I do that at home, but I do that at home when I'm surrounded by plugs. So I know that whenever it gets low, I can just plug it in.
Yeah.
It's very rare that I am somewhere in the field and can't plug it in and have no battery left. And if it's rare, it's probably on me to bring a charger for it, not on Apple to load every single iPad down with that extra weight.
Yeah. I agree. The M4. Did you notice any benefits compared to the M2 when you were just working with the iPad? Was Safari snappier?
Well, it's snappier. Oh yeah, snappier. It is, although it's very hard to tell, right? New iPad, just migrated some files. It seemed extremely fast, but it always does. I think maybe I didn't get a lot of chance to do, like, I got a beta of Logic, but I just did not have the time with the turnaround of this to try it out. And I didn't spend a lot of time in something like Final Cut, although I will at some point. I did edit a podcast in Ferrite Recording Studio and do an export from there. And, that export went really fast. I mean, even an M2 is pretty darn fast on iPadOS. So the M4, I feel like beyond your Final Cut and Logics of the world and maybe Procreate, I did some stuff in Affinity Designer as well, which was fine, and that's a very powerful app. Although fonts, iOS fonts, we'll talk about that later. I had some real font problems that slowed me down for half an hour.
Yeah.
But
I
suspect that, and I hope that there will be future versions of iPadOS that leverage the M4 power more, because it's the same old story, which is Apple comes out with an iPad Pro and the chip is so powerful that it's never really going to be tapped by the operating system, or if it is, it's going to be years before software really can take advantage of it. And my personal iPad Pro is an M1, and I never even was motivated by the M2. It doesn't feel slow in any real way. So yeah, it's more powerful. That's great. I guess my biggest processor sucking app is probably Marvel Snap, and because I've got it set to 60 frames a second and high quality graphics and all of that, and it's janky. It's a janky app. It's got lots of weird, it flashes and blinks and things. It's doing, I don't even know what they're doing under the hood there, but it was smooth. I mean, I'm not going to advocate anybody spend $1,200 on an iPad to play Marvel Snap, but boy, that was pretty nice.
You are kind of saying that though.
Yeah, I guess that's right. It's a video player. Well, I mean, on one level, whenever we review these things, it's like, it's not my judgment about how much money you want to spend. I used to argue this back at Macworld. There was a period where the old regime at Macworld would rate products down based on their price. And I said, well, wait a second. We don't know what price people are going to get for this in the future, and we also don't know what their budget is. Shouldn't we rate it based on, like, human beings are going to adjust whether they buy a product or not based on how much it costs. We don't need to do that for them. We should tell them whether it's good or not. And so I think about that when I say, like, it's more like, I don't know how big the market is for just a video viewer that costs $1,000. But this is a really nice one, right? If all it is, like, M4 is overkill, but like, if you really want an OLED video player that you can hold in your hands, it's really nice. And so I'm not going to judge you. If it's worth the money for you to do that, then great.
Yeah, I mean, maybe there's a professional Marvel Snap player out there who's streaming Marvel Snap on Twitch, and having an iPad with OLED that makes Marvel Snap run better than before. Maybe it's a good deal for them. So,
maybe.
Is there anything else you want to mention about the hardware of the tablet itself before we move on to the real hardware of the accessories?
I didn't notice much difference. I did a FaceTime call with my mom for her birthday using the new position of the FaceTime camera, and it just feels so much more natural. I always use it in that orientation, so it was very nice. I had a few moments where I had Face ID fail me, and I realized that I tend to hold the iPad with the wrap of the keyboard or of the Smart Folio up, and Apple totally wants you to have it down so you can have your pencil up.
Okay.
And that means that the camera's at the bottom. And so I had several times
why did you do that?
I was trying to unlock it. I think it's because at some point I had a Folio that I wasn't comfortable with, like, how strongly it was attaching magnetically. And so if I held it down, then I was holding the Folio against the back case. Whereas if you hold it up, it can, like, pop off. I don't know. It's a bad habit. I have to break myself of it. But it meant that when I was flipping up to open, I was literally, like, flipping over the Face ID sensor, and it yelled at me. Or it was, like, down in my blanket. I was waking up, and I was like, no, pull it back up. So I had to flip that around. But it's really nice to have it there. And beyond that, I guess I would say, there was Mike speculated about MagSafe. I've heard, John Syracuse say there should be more than one port on it. I think when I was doing a podcast and I had a microphone plugged into it, and I realized that I was glad I had 10 hours of battery life, I thought, well, this can be an issue. And we gave that one port MacBook a hard time for it. But I think the truth is, I have to go back to what we said before, which is most people don't need more than one port. So I think you probably just need to put it on the people to get a hub, to get a dock of some kind, if you really need to use it with many, many devices, because I don't, if they could put a second port on there and have it be no problem, but there are probably a lot of compromises that would have to happen to get a second Thunderbolt port on this thing. And it seems, unnecessary for most people. So it doesn't bother me.
All right. So Magic Keyboard and Apple Pencil Pro. Let's start with the Magic Keyboard. So I want to ask you about the function row. This is arguably, I think, along with the bigger trackpad, one of the most important changes in this keyboard. One of the things I noticed when I was testing the extra function row in London, that I a couple of times I sort of accidentally bumped into the lower edge of the iPad when I was trying to access the function row. Is that something that also happened to you, or is it something that happens and then you adjust?
I think there's probably some adjustment. It never happened to me, and I think maybe that has something to do with using it. I mean, I don't know about the difference between the 11 and the 13. There's possibly something there. It also may be the angle that you're pointing it. Maybe the angle that I was using was a little bit more kind of up, because if you angle it lower down, it's going to lower itself down closer. But I never ran into that. And I used it on a table, and I used it in my lap, and I never really ran into that. What I did notice is on a very soft surface. So at one point when I was doing that podcasting, I was on the bed in the hotel room, and I put the iPad down on the bed, and the bed was a little, the blanket wasn't perfectly flat. It was just kind of moving around, and it was a little bit soft. And I put the iPad in the keyboard down, and it flopped over backward. And I realized this thing is balanced on the head of a pin. Like it is balanced. It isn't going to fall over backward in any normal circumstance, but the moment you shift the weight a little bit back, it will fall over backward, because they have engineered that thing very precisely to stay upright. And it will, but it a little bit off, and it will just kind of go over. The whole thing will just tip backward. But I didn't have a problem reaching the function row, and the function row, it's great. I was listening to music, and I was like, some of it was artificial, but I'm listening to music. I'm like, I don't like this track. I'm going to go to the next track. It could be a little bit louder. And that OLED's, it's kind of bright. Let's make it a little bit dimmer. And just being able to do that while I was writing and keeping my hands on the keyboard, and not having to, reach up and find the right control in order to get it to all work. Just really nice. Although I mentioned in the review, I can't believe that you can't adjust the keyboard brightness via a keyboard shortcut, that there isn't a, globe brightness or command of those brightness keys, because a lot of people don't even know that it's backlit. I'm not going to name names, but a recent Relay podcast mentioned that the Magic Keyboard still doesn't have backlighting. And it's like, it's always had backlighting. It's always been there, but you have to go to settings, keyboard, hardware keyboard. Backlighting. It's so dumb. That should be it should be in Control Center, or it should be a keyboard shortcut. Shortcut, right? So anyway, but I did use those keys, some more than others. I didn't really use the dictation key, although it's there. Quick lock is not a bad idea, and I did use their expose key, basically, that brings up the individual app view, like you're doing a swipe up. And I use that a little bit too, but I prefer the trackpad gesture for that. But boy, it's just really nice to adjust the volume, and because I've had that on my Mac for like 20 years, keyboard shortcut to adjust my music playback without thinking about it, and then to not have that available at all on the iPad was incredibly frustrating. So I'm very happy, and I didn't really bump into the top of the iPad at all.
Nice. The trackpad, so it's larger than before. It seemed a bit taller than before, basically. And it supports haptic feedback. And I read in your review that Apple also sprinkled some haptic feedback here and there in some of the built-in apps. Like, for example, when you're reordering songs in an Apple Music playlist, I believe you mentioned.
Yes.
You can feel a little haptic feedback going on. Can you explain what this feels like?
That's a little like that's the roller coaster ride of this feature. If you want the demo of the haptic feedback in the trackpad on the Magic Keyboard, rearrange items in Up Next in Music, because every tick is a bump on the haptic. So you drag a track down, and it just goes bup, 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 boop, as it goes down. But also, if you do long press, it will do a tap as it triggers. If you do a 3-finger swipe up, as you bring it up, it will do a tap as it brings up that the app switcher view.
Yeah.
So it's not quite. Oh, and there's an API. So in I forget, what is it, in Numbers, or maybe it's the guides in like Keynote and Pages, but there are some things like that too, where there's a snap to guides happening where there's actually a little tap. And I would say it's not quite as obnoxious as the one on the desktop Magic Trackpad. These are just little grace notes. They're little accents. They're not huge boosts to usability, but I think they're trying to go for a little bit of delight, as well as trying to make the user interface a little more tactile, and that's fine. You can't turn it off, so I hope you like it.
You can turn it off. Interesting.
I not that I could find. I think that they're on. That may be a next version OS feature to turn it actually off, because obviously that was one of the things they had to put in this version of iPadOS in order to ship this thing, was some of these specific features for the Magic keyboard. But yeah, it's subtle, but as a clicker, it works really well. Like, it is just like with the laptops and the desktop Magic Trackpad, where it doesn't move anymore, but you wouldn't ever know. It feels perfectly normal to click on it. And I've definitely heard from people who've said that they, in a quiet space where they're endlessly clicking using the old Magic Keyboard, they feel, I think it's more internalized than it is reality, but they feel like they're making these loud clicks in a quiet room with that moving trackpad, and that's gone. It doesn't make that noise. It doesn't move anymore. Now it's just doing a little vibration on your finger. But I think they did a good job. I think it's executed really well, and it's nice having a little more space for using your finger to move around on the trackpad. I think that's nice too, and that's why they pushed back. They used the decreased weight to push the cantilever back a little bit. It sits further back. I guess that arm of it is a little bit shorter, so that it sits further back, so that they can get that extra room on that plane, that keyboard plane for the trackpad and the function row.
Right. What do you think of the new material, the new aluminum material in the sort of palm rest area?
Yeah, it's really familiar. I mean, they're basically making it feel like you're using a laptop, like a MacBook.
Okay.
And I liked it. I have no complaints. It went from being a kind of different, that different kind of rubbery feel around the keys, to being just like you're using a MacBook Air. It really, really does. I think what's funny is that the other side of it is still the rubberized.
The rubber, yeah.
Yeah, and that which is fine. I don't mind it. And I wonder about the long-term wear on the port, because like it feels very much like
you mentioned this in your story, that there's an area where the rubber backing sort of attaches to the metal base. Yeah, and you're concerned about the durability of that.
It feels like that's an interface point that could wear badly, and I wonder about, like, are they glued on? And we won't know, but it wouldn't surprise me if a year or two in, people were looking at that and going, "What's going on here?" And Apple had to make some repairs or whatever.
Start coming apart.
Yeah, that's my concern. And again, it's just when I looked at it, it's a very weird area where it doesn't feel like there's a natural flow from one plane to the other. It really is like one is just stuck on the other one. And I hope they've tested that sufficiently and that they're confident that it's going to wear okay, because that's the thing that really bothered me. But otherwise, it's on the outside, it's super familiar. I didn't have any problem opening it up. Opening it up is a little different, but I didn't have any problem. I know some people were a little concerned about that, but it seems pretty reasonable to me.
Okay. So what about the Pencil Pro? Have you? I mean, you're not.
No.
Knowing you're not much of an artist.
No. Very bad.
Same. But yeah, you did tell me that it's possible to program the Apple Pencil Pro to run a shortcut when you perform the squeeze gesture.
Yes.
So maybe that's something you can use.
Yeah. So the breaking news here. Perhaps I'm the only ones who have done this. I haven't done this yet. But yes, you can, in settings, set the squeeze gesture to, it can use Pencil Kit in apps that support that. You can also have it be an eraser. Just say always have it be an eraser. But one of the functions is run a shortcut.
Interesting. It's like a little action button, but for your Apple Pencil.
On your Apple Pencil. Yeah, that's where the action button on the iPad Pro is. It's on the Apple Pencil. So I don't know. Again, I have not done this because I was so busy writing the review that I thought I cannot play with this. But I do wonder what is that? Like, what would be the scenario where you'd run a shortcut? But maybe you're just, not even drawing on the screen. You just kind of pick up your pencil and squeeze it.
Yeah, maybe you're just using it as a little shortcut.
Squeeze remote.
Shortcut. Yeah, squeeze remote.
Just point the thing at the screen and squeeze it and see what happens. Yeah, but I love that it's there, right? I love that like they didn't need to do that, but I think that they for all of the issues with shortcuts on iPad, I do like the idea that they seem to have philosophically decided that they're going to build like these features into a feature. Like it can do A, B, C, or D. And then it's like, well, what else could we do? They're like, well, I don't know. Put a shortcut in there, and then we'll see what people do with it. We can't wait to see what you do with it.
It'd be so much more interesting and flexible, I think, if only shortcuts supported any kind of like context. Like if I squeeze my Apple Pencil and I'm using Safari, or if I squeeze my Apple Pencil and I'm using, I don't know, OmniFocus or something. Like that would be interesting, I think, to sort of tie that to some sort of foreground window context.
Right.
But so you just set a shortcut and it's system wide. So whenever you squeeze, you run that shortcut.
Yeah, squeeze to do not disturb. Sure.
Yeah,
you could do that.
Sure. Why not? I mean, why not?
Why not?
So anything else about the pencil that you want to mention?
No, I mean, I edited a podcast in Ferrite. It felt very familiar. I think the haptic. Speaking of haptics, I think the haptic is done really well. It just feels sort of natural. I know that they said it's up in the top of the barrel, but it doesn't feel like that. The illusion is pretty solid. I didn't really use barrel roll other than to just draw some things in badly and go, oh yeah, look, it turns. But I'm sure that if you're an artist, having the ability to use non-circular brushes and vary them on the fly is good. I would imagine that there'll be some very clever things that are used where you end up using it almost like you're turning a knob, where you're rotating the pencil in other apps and it's scrubbing video, or I don't know. There are some other things that could probably be done with it. I'm looking forward. Obviously, only a very small handful of apps were able to build custom anything for it. Most of them heard about it first last week and are going to now have to dig into those APIs. But I think that there's some potential there. I love the Apple Pencil. I don't use it very often, but this one, it feels exactly like the old one. In that it is essentially an interfaceless object. I think Mike and I might have talked about it last week, but I think you could argue in some ways that this is the ideal of Apple design, which is it's just an object. It doesn't feel like a tech object at all. Yeah. It is unrecognizable as a piece of technology other than like a pencil, a non-functional pencil. But it is actually packed with technology and is amazing.
Yeah. You close your review with a pretty large section about iPadOS.
I do.
And the state of iPadOS.
I do.
So we've been having this conversation over the past few days, and you obviously brought up a bunch of issues that you have run into when you were trying to use your iPad Pro almost exclusively, I guess, over the past 5 days, right?
Yeah.
What's your sort of takeaway? Looking at this iPad, this brand new iPad Pro, incredible technology, super thin, lighter than before, OLED. 1 month before WWDC, and you're working with this iPad Pro on iPadOS 17. What's sort of your takeaway of this experience?
So we're in a minute we're going to talk about your piece, which is answering everybody who asked us all last week. You keep saying the iPad has limitations. What are they? Because I realized and you realized that, unless you literally have been reading everything we've written and listened to every podcast we've done over the last 5 years, you may have missed it and we haven't summed it up. So I thank you for writing an article that sums it up. And then I went and wrote the end of my review and I was like, oh, I'm sort of summing it up here a little bit. But so before we get to your piece, I'll just say I was struck by how the iPad really has gotten better over the last 5 years. That I have not been pushing the iPad as hard the last few years since COVID, really, and Apple Silicon. So the MacBook Air came out, I got a MacBook Air, and I thought, well, I'll just travel with this. And so I haven't had to push it in all of those other areas. But, some of the apps have progressed. Some of the OS has progressed. A lot of the things that bothered me, before we get maybe a little more negative about all the things that iPadOS does wrong, I will just say I had a moment where I thought I was going to have to pack. I was like, do I need a card reader? How do I get and I'm like, oh, no, I can literally attach my audio recorder via the same USB cable to the iPad, and it will see it as an SD card. It'll see it as a storage device, and I can copy that file over. And I can download the Zoom now supports a recording with all the individual tracks separate up in the cloud, which it didn't used to do, which is a great way to do a backup of a podcast. And I can download those files individually. And in the last few years, there's a download manager in Safari, and that file goes into the Files app. And then I was able to very easily import those into Ferrite and edit my project. And I thought, okay, like I remember traveling where I had like the SD card that was also a Wi-Fi of its own, so that I could use a custom app
devices
to copy it over to, and it was so bad. And it's not that bad anymore, but one of the reasons I have to copy that file over is that I can't record my microphone on iPadOS. So like there's still those walls there, but I was just reminded that with the Magic Keyboard and with the improvements that they made to files, and I used a lot of Stage Manager, that it really has come a long way in 5 years. I might argue that there's huge pieces that are still kind of missing or broken, and we will do that after the next break. But I was flashing back to when it was way less capable than it is even today. And I was grateful that, oh yes, it behaves like a computer. If I attach a disk to it, I can look at the files on the disk. That didn't used to be possible. So better than I remember when I was trying to do all of this in 2017.
Yeah, that's for sure.
This episode of Upgrade is brought to you by Delete Me. Privacy is important to lots of us. I know Mike talks about this regularly, that he gets his reports from Delete Me that make sure that information is staying private, because there's so many places online that want to sell our information. And, we don't want ours to be a part of it. With Delete Me, we know that someone is working on our side to make sure that our information stays just with us. Do you ever wonder how much of your personal data is out there on the internet for anyone to see? It can be a super uncomfortable thought, especially when you consider having too much information out there can lead to identity theft attempts, phishing, harassment, unwanted spam calls. I get so many of those now. I made the mistake of putting my number in somewhere, and they sold it to everybody. You can protect your privacy with Delete Me. Having your personal info on the internet can feel like leaving doors open. Delete Me can keep that door locked and your information safe, so you don't need to worry about waking up one day to find out your information has been compromised. It removes any personal information you don't want online and makes sure it stays off. It's a subscription service that removes your personal info from the largest people search databases on the web, and in the process helps prevent potential ID theft, doxing, and phishing scams. Delete Me does the hard work for you. You'll even get regular personalized privacy reports showing what info they found, where they found it, and what they removed. It's not just a one-time service. They're monitoring regularly on your behalf. Take control of your data. Keep your private life private. Sign up for Delete Me, and you'll get a special discount, 20% off your Delete Me plan when you go to joindeleteme.com/upgrade20 and use the promo code upgrade20 at checkout. The only way to get 20% off, joindeleteme.com/upgrade20 and enter code upgrade20 at checkout. That's joindeleteme.com/upgrade20, code upgrade20. Thank you to Delete Me for supporting this show and Relay FM. All right, Federico, it's time for us to talk about your story now, which is not an iPad Pro review.
It's not an iPad Pro review.
But
it's right there in the title.
It is the title of it. It's on Mac Stories right now. We'll put a link in the show notes. But because you didn't get it, which is sad because everybody wants to see a review of the iPad Pro, and including people like me who also write reviews of the iPad Pro, I do think you did a a good service for all of us who talk about the context of where the iPad is and where it falls down. Because you and I think, both approach this device from a real position of appreciation for all the things that it can do and its potential.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
it's the only computer I want to use, and I just bought one. So like, I'm committed. Like this is my computer. But yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So the customer service, the service to listeners and readers that you performed is going into WWDC, which I think is also important. Like, where are we with the current version of iPadOS? And when we say that we're frustrated by its limitations, when we say the hardware is great but the software doesn't match, a lot of people say, well, what do you mean? It seems fine to me, right? And we're like, oh, where do we start? And so you were able to sort of like go through the details, and it made me smile. I mean, and also kind of be sad, but the details of what it still doesn't do, like individually, you could maybe shrug it off, but then there is also this just cumulative effect of just a giant, like, does it matter there's no calculator? Well, no, you can get pCalc, or other calculators are also available, but why? And preview and text edit and journal and Apple and sports. Apple's launched a bunch of apps that don't even
book.
Yeah,
because of those
and
fonts,
the fonts
that you try.
Oh, the fonts, which I rant about in my review a little bit. That I had a big speed bump where I couldn't get the right font to appear on my iPad, and the way Apple didn't make it, they were like, we support fonts now, and we're like, yay! But the detail is, we support a font app section in the App Store that doesn't seem to be there, or an API that allows apps to sideload fonts themselves. So strange. And they could just do something like Fontbook and say, do you have a font file? Well, it's installed now. And they don't do that. How did you feel writing this story? Was it cathartic for you? Did you feel like you're just get it all off my chest, or was it more like a bad flashback?
It actually felt better than when I did the story on the original version of Stage Manager. Like that story, I really hated working on that story.
That was a low point.
Ago.
Yeah, that was a low point.
That was a low point. No, this one, it actually was cathartic, and it made me feel like I feel pretty good about the story. Because the approach was basically, so every single time there's always like a new iPad Pro review, and it comes out, and there's always that line, that sort of parenthesis that says great hardware, but it's the software, and literally everybody says that, and I say that, and I mention, you say that, would say, oh, the limitations of iPadOS, and then I get that person on Mastodon who, rightfully so, is like, hey, the iPad works great for me, what do you mean? And so I thought, and that was literally my process of like, where do we even begin? And I realized, well, let's begin. Like, let's actually put it all together, like, at least from my perspective, my frustrations, in a single story that, one, can be useful for me, because like it's useful reference material to keep around, and hopefully can somebody at Apple, anyone, can maybe read the story and maybe understand, like, once you lay it all out together, as you mentioned, like in isolation those are not probably huge issues, but when you get that cumulative effect of like, oh, it's this small problem and this small problem and this other small thing, like it starts piling up, and it doesn't make for a pleasant experience, to the point where you have these features that have been semi-broken or just done halfway for the past decade of the iPad, and I felt like it was time to finally just have it all out in a single story on the site.
Yep, for me, and I ranted about this too, like I sometimes get the, well, what do you, I mean, so it doesn't do podcasting, who cares, you're such a small niche. It's like, I think that's fair, although I would make the argument, and I do in my review, that what is pro workflow but a big collection of small niches, right? Like that's what, to be a pro product is to not explicitly support 4 workflows. To be a pro product, in my mind, means you have to have the power and flexibility to support all of the niche workflows, because pros, there's no, like, what do you do? I'm a pro. I do pro stuff. That's not it. There's thousands of little tiny jobs.
What's the American expression? The rising tide that lifts all boats?
Oh, lifts all boats?
Yeah,
sure.
It's something like that, where you need to...
It's the little boats. The pros are the little boats.
Exactly. The pros are the little boats, and Apple is the rising tide, I guess.
Yeah, something like that. Or iPad features the rising tide. I'm not quite sure, but it's that idea that it's not, well, it supports X, therefore it's pro. It's more like it supports a range of things that different pros can use, and I think that's where it falls down. When I wrote my story, when I was visiting my mom and not using an iPad, I wrote the story and basically said the problem fundamentally is that everything on the iPad only happens because Apple says it's okay, and that's not how you can build pro features. So the podcast example, like, I can talk about the fact that it's silly that you can't do something like audio hijack and just say, can I record my microphone, my USB microphone attached to this iPad while I'm also in another app doing a video conference? And the answer is no, because you can't do two things at once on a device with an M4 processor and 16 gigs of RAM that supports multitasking. But the broader issue would be that the audio subsystem of iPadOS is incredibly, I would say laughably primitive. And the general example, and you and I both used it, is you're playing some music. This is where it bites me. I'm playing some music, and there's a little video clip in Ivory posted on social media somewhere. And I just want to play the video clip. And on the Mac, if I do that, what happens is my music keeps playing. And on my Mac here in my office, my music keeps playing via AirPlay, and then via the Mac speakers, the audio and video from social media play. On the iPad, when you do that, it says, hold on. Stop the music.
Two things at once.
Stop the music.
That's not.
You have to watch this video, and then, and this is true. And then when I'm done with the video, I press play on the Magic Keyboard, and you know what happens? The video resumes. It doesn't go back to my music because it's like, oh no, I'm playing social media videos now. That's what I'm doing. It's so frustrating. And so I feel like that's our point with a lot of these things is it's not just the detail, it's that the detail is indicative of a larger issue where there's things that have been left, as you said, either unimproved for years or a decade or more, or they do an update like files. You really have it in for files, which I think is totally fair. Files, I can say files is so much better than it used to be, and is okay. But everything you list in is like, this should have all been fixed over the last 5 years, and instead they sort of shipped files to where it is now and seem to have walked away.
Yeah, and honestly, that feeling kind of applies to many other things on iPad, especially multitasking. Like, it almost feels like institutionally Apple has a tendency to release iPad features and then walk away for a couple of years and then come back after 3 years and be like, hey guys, we have a new feature for you on iPadOS. And you're like, well, what about the previous one? What? The previous one? No, there's no previous feature. Like, it does feel something like that sometimes. I also wanted to mention these other points that I think it's important because you and I think, and Steve Trapman-Smith and a bunch of other people who have been commenting on iPads for a while, we get this comment from people, very often these days. It's like, oh, these folks, they just want Apple to put macOS on the iPad. And I mean, I am literally the person with the handmade convertible Apple laptop. So I did this myself, but I did it sort of out of desperation, right? It's not like I want Apple to just put macOS on the iPad. That was a sort of a self-made solution to the problem of the iPad software not getting better. Ideally, I would prefer Apple to keep developing iPadOS for iPad forever and to actually improve it, going forward. I'm just saying that if that's not something that Apple thinks they can do, maybe it's time to consider macOS on the iPad. Conversely, if macOS on the iPad is absolutely a no-no from Apple, like we're never ever going to do it, you can't just let the iPad's operating system coast by, without these meaningful updates. Something needs to change, and that was sort of my conclusion of the story. Something needs to change because this situation where macOS is no-go for iPad, but also iPadOS doesn't really receive substantial updates for pro users, that's not working either. So something's got to give eventually.
Steve said something that I thought was really interesting about how if you were to virtualize macOS on iPad Pro at the high end, with lots of limitations, one theoretical advantage it gives you is it allows Apple to sell all the high end hardware of the iPad with a sort of a release valve, a pressure release that gives it infinite time to continue improving iPadOS until iPadOS reaches the point where it can do that. And I, the counter argument would be, would they? But I agree with you. I am not. I like the iPad, so it took a lot for me to suggest maybe you should just virtualize macOS. But it came from a place of being so worn down and kind of desperate to say, well, okay, I'm bargaining with you, Apple. If you're not going to be responsible enough to make iPadOS better in all of these ways, if it goes against your philosophy, if it's not worth it because the Pro user base is such a small fraction of the overall iPad user base that it's not worth the investment, maybe you should give up and just let people run macOS. I don't think it's the best idea. I think iPadOS should be better, but I could see the argument that most people don't care about those features. I have the counter argument, and I mentioned in my review, you absolutely went into details about it. One of the other things that really bugs me is background tasks, which is a fundamental from an iPhone that had no RAM and no processor and no battery. And so they designed iOS in the early days to be very aggressively a unitasker, and they've added very careful multitasking over time. And this is, it's a power user feature, but it's not a power user feature because all sorts of Mac users use background utilities. Things that run a backup in the background, things that are an alternative launcher, or something like Hazel that watches your files, or a clipboard manager, or something like the Stream Deck, or any other peripherals that need a thing that runs in the background to enable them to function. All of those things, or even global keyboard shortcuts, so you can run a shortcut at any point by hitting a keyboard command. These are, they're power user-ish features, but they also speak to like a broader flexibility of the operating system that other people can use. Imagine if on an iPad, a regular person could just download a clipboard manager and have it work. But that's one of those things that requires a level of background operation that iOS was never really designed for. And yet, how do you sell the iPad Pro in 2024 and have it be completely unable to run background software when it's one of the it's not a nerdy thing. It's a very common thing to run a menu bar app or something on Mac OS. And yet on the iPad, it's just not there. So I don't agree that it's just for like super computer nerds, but I think it makes your whole platform richer. And the fact that they can't do it it's so frustrating. So I want them to make iPadOS better, and I know you do too, because that's talking about it. Virtualizing macOS is like a Hail Mary. It is a desperation move to say, could this hardware be quickly made much more flexible? And like, I still think they could do it, but like, it's not the ideal outcome. The ideal outcome is iPadOS gets better.
Yeah, that's what I hope will happen. It's why I wanted to make it clear in the story that is my ideal goal. That is my hope for the future of the iPad. And so now I have this article up there on Mac Stories, sort of as a you're welcome, as a sort of as a capsule in time of the problems and frustrations that we have experienced. And it's there. So
I hate to say it, but it comes from a place of love. We those of us who are really enthusiastic about the iPad are in part enthusiastic about it because it has such incredible potential, and the things that it does well, it does better than any other Apple product.
Yeah.
Like I had that thought this weekend. It was like, it's a MacBook Air when I want it to be, except for the software issues. And then I pop it out and it's just a little tablet. Like I can't, and then I get a pencil and I'm doing pencil interactions and editing a podcast with a pencil. Like, it's amazing. And the iPhone doesn't do that.
You put a controller around it. You have a giant monitor to play video games. Like it can transform into so many different things. It's incredible.
Yes.
Yeah. So it does come from a place of love. Like all the criticism and the frustrations, they really do. Yeah.
All right. Well, Federico, thank you so much for being on
thank
Upgrade.
you.
It took 2 connected hosts to fill in for Mike, but and I do love Mac Stories, I should say, and we'll say it at the end of the
Thank you.
show too, and Connected, and all the other podcasts you do in the Mac Stories podcast. There's so much in the Mac Stories Connected universe. But thank you so much for coming on Upgrade to talk about
Thank
iPads.
you. Been a pleasure. Thank you.
This episode of Upgrade is brought to you by ExpressVPN. You probably wouldn't take a call in public on speaker for everyone to hear. That's really annoying. Also, privacy. People are listening in. That too. Also, you're a jerk and don't do that. Using the internet without ExpressVPN is like taking that call. It's bad. Don't do it. Somebody could eavesdrop if they wanted to. ISPs can see all the websites you visit, and that data can be sold to others who might use that data to target you for marketing. Thankfully, you can use ExpressVPN, which reroutes your network data through a secure, encrypted tunnel so your ISP can't see or sell your online activity. It's super easy to use. You fire up the app and hit one button. It works on phones, laptops, even routers, so everyone who shares your Wi-Fi can be protected. It's no surprise ExpressVPN has been rated #1 by CNET and TechRadar. I have ExpressVPN on my iPad. One tap. They're not kidding. One tap. And I'm safe and secure no matter where I am, roaming around on the iPad, on random Wi-Fi in a random cafe somewhere in Oregon. Boom, ExpressVPN, turn on. Everything is locked and secure. When I went to New Zealand, I was able to turn on ExpressVPN and be back in America, which was really nice for all sorts of location reasons, to just sort of be secure and back in my home country where all my stuff was, digitally speaking. Protect your online privacy too. Go to expressvpn.com/upgrade today. That's expressvpn.com/upgrade. And you can get an extra 3 months for free. That's right. 3 months for free. expressvpn.com/upgrade. Thank you to ExpressVPN for their support of this show and Relay FM. Steven, welcome back.
Hello.
Thank you for hibernating during Federico. See, Federico lives way far away, and so we had to record that part before we recorded your part. That's a little behind the scenes action because he's Central Time is a little bit ahead of me, but Central European Time. Whoo! Wow, that's way out there.
It is a different ball game setting stuff up with Federico.
Wow, yes. I mean, you do this every week, right? It's a thing. So thank you for going into podcast hibernation, but you're back.
You're welcome.
Do you have any iPad related thoughts or questions to ask me now that we've broken the seal on that?
Yeah, well, I do, but first I want to say, I know you guys talked through Federico's article. I got a chance to read the draft over the weekend.
Yeah.
There are very few people on the planet who think more thoroughly about these things than Federico does.
Yeah, for sure.
And he was talking to several of us kind of after the event leading into this article, and I think if you want a what is up with iPadOS, there's no place better to look. And I hope that people at Apple who work on iPadOS take it to heart, because he knows their product better than almost anyone on the outside of the company. Yeah. So definitely go check that out. But yeah, I really just had, one question. I know you guys talked through a lot of stuff, but you've been a big iPad Pro user for really as long as I can remember.
Since the iPad Pro came out in 2015.
How has it been 9 years since the first iPad Pro came out?
I keep thinking it's like right when I went out on my own, but it was actually the next year. It was a year out on my own when it came out, and I bought that first iPad Pro, and that was a big for a brand new company and me out on my own. That was a big investment to buy an iPad Pro with a keyboard, but I totally did it. Yeah.
And you, like you said, you've continued on that path, and it just struck me I was rereading some of your old reviews, including your original iPad Pro review from 2015, in preparation for this. I was just struck that as an iPad user, you've kind of been on the front lines of like how they've improved the product the best. Because I think out of all the iPads, the big one has had the most meaningful improvements. I mean, if people don't remember, that original iPad Pro, it was kind of awkward, right? Because we were still in the home button era. It was pretty thick. It was pretty heavy.
And then there was the big keyboard, which was a revelation that Apple made a keyboard for the iPad, right? Because that was the people were arguing like, well, you shouldn't have a keyboard on your iPad, and they did it. But it was also that first generation one where it like folded over, so it was like half of it was super thick and awkward, and I'm like, I never carried that thing around in that case. I always just kept that case around because it was super awkward. But it was a big screen iPad that was, that they were trying to say, hey, everybody, do work on this thing. And they had the iWork apps for iPad. And they were really trying to say, no, we're trying to establish that the iPad is not just a lean back kind of thing. It's a lean forward kind of thing. And so, 9 years I've been working the fields on the iPad Pro. Just, tote that barge, lift that bale. I don't know, upload that podcast, something like that.
Sure. Well, you can't record a podcast on it, that's for sure. And that's really what I was getting at. And I think it's sort of the intersection between y'all's two pieces today, where this new iPad Pro is so incredible hardware-wise, but it still has the same problems the original one did 9 years ago. I mean, you have this piece in your original iPad Pro where you're talking about the hardware, and then on a single line you have the word "but." Yeah. And then the next subhead is talking about software. It's like, this could be written today.
I know.
In many ways, Federico's piece, your 2015 piece, they're all kind of the same lineage, because Apple just hasn't been able to move this forward in the way that a lot of us want. It just struck me on reflecting on the 9 years of the iPad Pro that while the hardware, I mean, the original one to this one seems like unbelievable progress.
Huge.
Yet the frustrations are kind of the same when you boil it down.
Right. Yeah, the pace of progress on the hardware side vastly exceeds the pace of progress on the software side. Not that there isn't progress, because like I said to Federico a couple earlier in the podcast, using it the last 5 days, I'm reminded of all the things that used to frustrate me back when I started doing this that are no longer the case. It has progressed. It's just not progressed as fast enough as the hardware. So, should we do some Ask Upgrade? Andrew asks, I'm currently using a 9th gen iPad that I want to replace a 5th gen iPad Air that got damaged that I used to replace. Okay, I want to get cellular in the next one, but mostly I use it for web browsing and streaming video. Should I get a 10th gen since the price has gone down, a new Air, or a refurbished 11-inch iPad Pro 4th gen since it's on the M series chips and will be supported longer? Wow. So many iPad choices here.
I know. So I pulled most of these questions, and that's why I pulled this one. Is like, this really shows the gamut of what's out there. And I think for most people, other than budget, which I think is obviously the biggest factor in this purchase for a lot of people, I think it's also kind of about the accessories. Depending on which iPad you get sort of radically different experiences. Yeah. When it comes, especially to the keyboard and trackpad. I mean, that 10th gen one has like the kickstand, there's all sorts of weird stuff going on there. And so I think you look at that. I mean, I think any of them would be an improvement, but also the 9th gen is still pretty good. Like they sold it until 8 days ago, and so I don't know if you've got to completely rush out and replace it just because it's old now. But I think look at the accessories, look at the budget. I think between the 10th gen and the Air, you would be fine either way.
Yeah, I think problem with questions that get sent in is that I have follow-up questions. So my answer would be like, do you want to use a keyboard with it? How do you feel about kickstands? Like, I don't like kickstands. So if I want to use a keyboard with an iPad, I'm not going to get the 10th gen, even though it's got bright colors and it's really nice. The keyboard story just doesn't work for me. And so
it's kind of weird.
I would not go down that path. New Air is going to be M series too, just like the 11-inch. So like the 11-inch iPad Pro 4th, New Air is an M2, right? So like I think the New Air is the place that you should maybe start, and then see like what price can you get for a refurbed iPad Pro, and what do you get, and does that make more sense for you? It's got Face ID. Face ID is really nice too. I like it. But the new Air and the old iPad Pros are very, very similar. So I'd say price them and see if there are specific features. How do you feel about the Apple Pencil? New Air will get you new Apple Pencil. Refurb iPad Pro will mean an older Apple Pencil without the fun new features. So if I had to guess, I'd say sweet spot is the new Air. But it really depends on how you use it. That's the beauty of the iPad, but also the complexity of it is that it's sort of defined by its accessories. But to answer the question, you have to weigh the accessories. Like Apple Pencil doesn't really matter to me because I could use any Apple Pencil to do what I do with an Apple Pencil, but keyboard really matters to me. So,
yeah, I think too, there's something else I wanted to highlight in this question about longevity. And really, I think it's right to praise Apple here. They do a pretty good job supporting devices for a long time. Every few years, some iPads and iPhones get cut off, but generally, you have years and years from when something goes off sale. And so the 10th gen versus, a new Air versus a refurbished 11-inch iPad Pro, I don't know if, 5, 6, 7 years down the road, how different the cutoffs will be for that software. And so I don't think it would be drastically different. I think it could be a year or two, but generally what I'm saying is Apple does a good job at keeping these things supported for a long time. And so I don't necessarily rank that super high in my rubric of which one should I get.
B wrote in and said, Apple removing the ultra-wide camera on the new iPad Pro surprised me. Do you think they did this to avoid needing to add support for spatial video? I don't think the spatial video really is affected, although I would say that based on the existing cameras that were there, I'm not sure the quality. I think they want the quality of spatial video to be better, and the iPhones that are coming this fall will up the quality there, but I don't think that was the motivation. It is weird for Apple to remove features from a new generation of a product, right? That doesn't happen that often. And they took the ultra-wide out. It's just gone. This was an iPad with 2 rear cameras, and they're like, nope, 1 rear camera. That's all you get. 1 12-megapixel rear camera. But if I had to guess, I'd guess that they're trying to save money and space. And that they probably have some access to some very secret internal Apple statistics that showed that nobody used that camera. That's my guess. That's the best. And I think that they like telling the story about the new True Tone with the multi LED True Tone flash and their machine learning on document scanning and stuff like that they can do. That is a first. I assume the iPhone will pick it up this fall, but it's a first on the iPad. You shouldn't have to buy an iPad to do a document scan. Your phone should be able to do that too. But I don't think it's about spatial video. My guess is that it's about saving space and weight and power and price because even though they raised the price of the iPad Pro, the adding OLED alone, I'm sure really increased the actual cost of building and the cost of parts.
And there's 2 of them in there.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Tandem
panels. So yeah, that's my guess. But it is a weird move, right? Obviously there was some sort of reason, but I don't think it's spatial recording related, is my guess. Connor wrote in to say, I want to get an iPad mini, but I feel like I should wait at this point. Given the lack of an update to the mini last week, is all hope lost? Do we think the mini will be revised, or will it go the way of the iPhone mini, and should I get one while I still can? Well, Connor, good news. Mark Gurman said there is a new mini coming. We think of Apple as this kind of all-powerful, enormous entity, right? But I don't think Apple has the capability to switch every single iPad production line at once. I think that they're like, no. That's because there's factories. There's lots of physical implications in doing it. So they did 2 now, and they'll do 2 later. And Mark Gurman says maybe the end of the year or early next year there will be a new iPad mini. So I wouldn't buy a new iPad mini if you could avoid it, because there is a new one coming, and I am sure it will be a pretty dramatic upgrade because they only get updated every few years. You still use a mini?
I do. Yeah, I've got an iPad mini. It's right here on my desk.
Nice.
The iPad mini, other than the first couple, where they really iterated pretty quickly, it has slowed down to this sort of irregular, every couple of years it gets an update. And yeah, I think, spec wise, it will get an update. There are these people out there, and could be one of them, honestly, that wants like a pro level iPad mini. It's like, well, what if tandem OLED was in a small tablet? That'd be awesome. But I think the iPad mini kind of lives in the space, kind of like the iPad Air, but you're paying a bit of a premium over the 10th gen for the size. But Gurman says it is coming, and I agree with you. It would be great if they could just roll out, hey, we've done everything, but they have to prioritize. They have to line up all of these different things. And it seems like the mini, maybe it'll be this fall. It could be tacked onto the iPhone. It could be if there's an October event, because there's also rumors of a bunch of M4 Max coming later this year.
Little pre-Christmas event. Seems like if it's ready, that would be a great time to launch it.
Yeah, and the mini, I think, does pretty well in the holiday season, I would imagine.
I think so.
I think it's coming. I don't think it's going to go the way of the iPhone mini. I think that's a very different situation.
Oh, pour one out for the iPhone mini. Oh,
I know. My wife just moved off hers this weekend.
I just saw somebody with one the other day, and I was like, oh. But then again, I look at my phone, and I'm like, it's fine. I don't need to go back to that.
Yeah.
But I miss it.
Mary went from a 13 mini to a 15 this weekend, and she picked it up off her nightstand this morning, and I just heard,
yeah. Sam writes, if Apple were to launch an iPhone Air to sit between the iPhone and the iPhone Pro, which features would you bring to the Air, and what would you leave to the Pro?
Oh,
Sam,
I love this question.
I hate this question so much. I would argue that the current iPhone is the iPhone Air, and that the iPhone SE and past models are the iPhone. That would be my
fascinating.
My argument is that the iPhone is already positioned in that spot, and the older iPhones and the SE are the low end, because there's no iPad SE, right? I think they just approach it differently. But hey, if you want to spitball on what features you take and put in an iPhone Air, I would love to hear.
The one that came to mind immediately, and it may come to the iPhone 16, is the always-on display. In setting up my wife's iPhone 15 last night, I kept looking over it and be like, oh, why isn't the screen not on? Because it's, I know it's not the mini, right? It's sort of now a normal-sized phone. And it's like, the always-on screen is so good. And I have, a bunch of widgets on my home screen and a faded out, version of my wallpaper. I love that I can just glance at my phone and see what's going on. And I think everyone should have that. So that would be something I would pull down. I think the other thing I would consider pulling down maybe is a third camera. That was actually a conversation we had this weekend by my wife a phone. Is like, it's like, we can do whatever you want. Like if you want the 15 or the 15 Pro, I showed them both to her at the stores. Like, the difference is primarily that you would notice it is the third camera, that telephoto. And it does unlock some interesting creative things. And, maybe there's a world where the Pro is 5X and 10X or something, if they can continue to improve the, whatever they called it, the tetraprism, whatever, inside the Pro Max. Maybe there's room for like a more standard 2X. I don't know. But it is noticeable that third camera is, kind of there as a distinguishing factor that I think a lot of people would want, but maybe not with all the other stuff and all the expense that it brings.
I'll say more colors that are not as bright as cheaper models, but more of them than on the Pro models.
Yeah.
And I know this isn't the case, but it makes me laugh, so I'm just going to say it. Just to replace Face ID with the button Touch ID. Just to make
that could
people
be a way
angry.
to bring the price down.
Just make people angry. And finally, Jessica asks, are you concerned about the new iPad bending? Gasp. Bendgate. Could we have Bendgate back?
So our friends at Mac Rumors, and we have lots of friends over there, they put this thing on Threads 3 days ago.
Yeah.
Promoting Bendgate before the iPad Pro comes out. Like, talk about missing the room. I don't love that.
Yep.
The replies to it are incredible. But just this weekend, there was an interview with Jaws and John Turnus, future Apple CEO, talking about a lot of things with the iPad. But one of the things that came out of it was the construction methods and I'm sure we'll see more of this the second iFixit has their hands on one, but changing the way that this iPad is actually constructed to make it stronger. And like there's like a new metal cover that sits on top of the logic board, and there's a central rib of metal that like make it stronger, make it more rigid. I think that's especially important on the 13 where you have more leverage.
Yeah.
And look, Apple's gotten this wrong before, right? Like look no further than the iPhone 6 Plus. Things can happen, but I suspect they've done their math here. And I think under most use cases, this won't be a problem. If you shut it in a car door or a trunk lid, like our friend John Voorhees did once on vacation, yeah,
Sure.
probably going to bend. But so did the old ones. So I think this is not going to keep me up at night.
Yeah, there will always be a gate. If it isn't bend gate, they will find some other gate. There will always be a gate because it's what gets the clicks. That's it, you know. Maybe it'll be a green gate, Stephen. Maybe it'll be a hiss gate. Those are good gates.
Sometimes screens turn green for no reason.
Should we invent a gate? Should we just like invent a gate
right now
for the new iPads? I'm gonna say, how about an accessory based gate? How about like a
pencil gate?
Yeah, I was thinking like function key gate. Or like charge gate. Maybe it doesn't charge as well in through the keyboard. But I do like pencil gate, and it could cover so many different sins.
Pencil gate's also fun to say.
Pencil gate,
right?
All right, we don't know what pencil gate is, but we're looking at that Apple Pencil Pro, and we are suspicious. Something is going on there. Pencil gate.
Brace
Hashtag
yourselves.
pencil gate. All right, if you love Upgrade, by the way, you should subscribe to Upgrade Plus, where you get no ads and bonus content every week and access to the Relay FM members Discord. This week, Steve and I are going to talk about iPod Nanos, and we're going to rank them. And it's going to get wild. Go to getupgradeplus.com for more. But this brings us to the end of this episode. Send us your feedback. Mike will be back next week. Feedback, follow-up questions, upgradefeedback.com. You can do Snell Talk there. You can do Ask Upgrade there. Check my stuff out. My new iPad Pro review is up now at sixcolors.com. Listen to my podcast at theincomparable.com and here at Relay FM. And Steven, of course, 512pixels.net. It's the episode number, 512, followed by pixels.net.
Synergy.
Yes, and I don't even know. You're on the socials at various things.
I'm having some trouble there. There's a bunch of links in the sidebar at 512 Pixels.
There you go.
But I also host
Link in
Mac
bio.
Power Users.
Yes,
on Sunday.
Here at Relay. Matt, yes,
if you're... And then some show with a couple of Europeans on Wednesdays.
Yes, indeed. A very serious technology-related podcast. So I am Jay Snell at Zeppelin.flights on Mastodon. That's the best place to find me on the socials, I suppose. Mike will be back next time. Federico, we should say, MacStories.net. You'll see his article there and a whole lot more. And then he's also on a podcast on Relay called Connected, and many other podcasts in the Mac Stories family. Its own little podcast collection that's happening over there.
He's a busy
guy.
man.
Busy guy. But and thank you again to Federico for taking time out to talk about the iPad with me on this episode. Of course, we have our video clips, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube. Upgrade Relay is the name to search for. And we continue to sell merch at upgradeyourwardrobe.com. I think our merch drop is basically over at this point for the special stuff, but there's ongoing available merch at upgradeyourwardrobe.com. Thank you to all the members who support us with Upgrade Plus, and thank you to our sponsors, Fitbod, Delete Me, and ExpressVPN. Is this how saying goodbye works on Upgrade? Mike will be back next week, and he can do it right. But thank you all for listening, and until next time, Stephen Hackett, say goodbye.
Bye, y'all.